black, 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 and red, 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 and yellow, 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 red, yellow, red, white, 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 yellow, brown, 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 white, white, yellow, brown, 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 red, red, yellow, black, and red, red.
Hello and welcome to another episode of Outer Sounds. We are here today with Cheri Knight and Steve Peters, and we'll be chatting about the Olympia Evergreen State College scene of the late 70s, early 80s. And also, we will be talking about Cheri's new album on Freedom to Spend, American Rituals.
Freedom to Spread.
Yeah, Freedom to Spread around. This is going to be the September selection for Outer Sounds. So we'll be sending that out to subscribers at the beginning of September. Welcome, Cheri and Steve. Thanks for joining me today.
Hi.
How are you doing?
Hi.
Good.
Great to be here.
Good. So, I wanted to start off our conversation with both of you, maybe talking about your background in music, growing up, and how you sort of found yourselves together at Olympia, in Olympia at Evergreen State College in the late 70s, and how you met up, and then we can talk about that, the vibrant scene there and the music that you were all creating at that time. So, Cheri, if you want to start.
Yeah, okay. So my history with music was, my mother played piano, and we always had a piano in the house. My father was a really good sax and clarinet player, although he, was the breadwinner of the family and a busy guy. So his sort of musical pursuits were kind of minimal. But when he did break the horns out, he was quite good. And I just really liked it. I just would sit at the piano and sort of drone away. And I had some lessons while I was in elementary school. And I just decided, without really even making a mental decision, but I didn't like it. I didn't like playing other people's music. And I had a really hard time getting standard notation off the page into my brain. And I just after a few years, I kind of stopped. And then in high school, I had a great music teacher. She was really young and she was really hip, and she turned us onto a lot of modern composers. And we did a lot of listening. She was the one who played 4 minutes, 33 seconds and took us to Amherst to see the Big Moog synthesizer. And I can't remember if that was privately owned or if it was one of the colleges. But
did she perform 4 minutes and 33 seconds, or did she play a record of it?
I can't. That is so funny. I can't remember. I honestly can't remember.
I had a music school teacher who, early on too, that performed it. They went and sat at the piano and was like, okay.
Oh, really? Yeah. It was so long ago. I can't really remember if she did sit at the piano, but I remember it being timed out, and that space and all of the stuff that was hanging there. And yeah, it was interesting because I do remember lots of fidgeting, and and I went right to the other sounds that were happening in the room. And it was really interesting. And I just sort of cellularly got that piece of music right then and there. And then and went to college. I went to a school in Eastern Washington for a couple of years, and was in their music department, and that just wasn't really a good fit for me. So I met a bunch of wild and wacky people that lived at Evergreen and ended up there after a couple of years. And that's where I met Steve and the sort of gang. And just was exposed to other people's ideas, and it was a verdant time
Yeah, it
for
seems
my
like that
learning.
was kind of a good place for you to land based on, what you were interested
Definitely.
in, yeah, and doing.
Yes.
How about
Abs-
you, Steve? Brief history of time.
Brief history. Well, let's see. When I was about, I don't know, fifth grade. I mean, things happened before that, but it's probably in around fifth grade I started taking guitar lessons. And I had this friend in school who took guitar lessons, and so I got in touch with her teacher, and he was this guy, kind of like this old beatnik guy named Bass Hutchinson, and he and his wife had a lounge duo called the Honeybees, and he tried to teach me how to play sort of like lounge standards on the guitar, so like
Oh,
autumn leaves and things like that, and
yeah.
reading notation. And at some point, like I wasn't really practicing, and my parents said, like, if you're not going to practice, then no more lessons. And so I quit that. And then a while later, probably when I was about 14, there was a store kind of near us called I think it was called the Four Muses. And it was sort of like they sold instruments, and it was a record store, and they also had a venue, and they had a lot of, this was in Southern California, and they had a lot of people like Jackson Brown would play there before anybody knew who he was. And this woman, Mary, who was sort of the matriarch of that scene, I started taking lessons from her. And she was much more like, here's a G chord, here's a D chord, here's a C chord, here's an A chord. Now you can play all these songs.
Right. Yeah.
And that was kind of much more gratifying, because pretty fast I could start figuring out like how to play Neil Young songs, off of records and stuff. And so that was pretty helpful. And then I started playing in garage bands, like in high school. And after high school, I tried to go to junior college to be a music major, and all the theory stuff kind of like went right over my head. I mean, I could kind of read music at this really rudimentary level, but I was trying to learn sight singing and harmony and all that stuff, and it didn't really. And the music department there was very oriented towards like big band jazz, and it was all these guys with chops, and
Yeah.
and so that was kind of not, I couldn't really fit in with that scene. But they had a really good electronic music department. They had like this big EMU synthesizer, and they had, I think, like an Oberheim and some other stuff. And it was run, the class was run by this guy named Len Sasso, who was one of the people who started sequential circuits.
Oh, okay. And this is in LA?
Yeah, Orange County, Southern
LA
California.
area. Yeah.
And so I took that class, and it wasn't enough to keep me in college. I dropped out, but the guy who was the TA for that class became a good friend of mine, and he was eventually the TA for the next guy who replaced Len Sasso, who was a guy named David Englert. And he said, "Oh, you should meet this new guy. He likes all this same weird music that you do." And, so I met him and took some piano lessons from him. And then he got a job teaching at Evergreen, and kind of said, this would be a good place for you. You could do your weird thing, and nobody would bother you. And, you don't have to learn how to read music. And so I ended up there, and Cheri and I were in that class together, and there you go.
Yeah. So, Evergreen's known for this kind of like very open environment, right? Where there's a lot of, students are free to like experiment. And somebody even said, oh, they don't even hand out grades there and all that kind of stuff. It was a very like obviously progressive educational system, or something very different from kind of your
total hippie school.
Traditional school. Yeah, exactly.
Yep.
Which is great. There should be more schools like that, I think.
Like Hampshire,
Yeah, there's a handful around the country, right?
Antioch.
Mm-hmm. Bard College, maybe a little bit like that.
Yeah.
Weirder than Bard.
Yeah, weirder than Bard, that's for sure. So once you guys met at this class, then, did you, it sounds like you both took advantage of, the studios there, and it sounded like they had, electronic instruments and tape machines and instrument library and stuff that you could take advantage of and record. How did you start recording there and making your own music?
Cheri, go.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah. The one thing I just want to add as sort of a precursor is the group contract that we were in. There were all different kinds of interests. There were musicians, there were engineers in the audio mod, and then there were people who wanted to write. And so you could find, it was your whole chess game. There were all the players were right there. And I would go so far as to say that our education was largely unsupervised. And it was basically, just, there were a lot of really not ambitious, but very energetic and enthusiastic people in the class who had no shortage of energy to pursue their own ideas. And I certainly consider myself one of them. And
really talented musicians too.
Yes.
So, like, you could write things or, work on stuff and get people to play it who were, they were all into it, so that was great.
Yeah.
And also the learning. I mean, I remember, when I met Steve, one of the things that, really blew me away, and it was, I think it was sort of part of the basis of our friendship, was that, he had done a lot more listening than I had. I mean, mine was a little bit more compartmentalized, I think. And I just remember going over to his house one day, and we just sat on the floor of his living room, and he just kept pulling out record after record. And he also had a lot of cassette tapes, and turned me on to a lot of music that I'd never heard.
Yeah.
And a lot of pop music I'd never heard. So that was part of the education as well.
I had worked at Tower Records before I went to Evergreen, so
yeah,
pretty good record collection.
You got a lot of good stuff. Yeah,
you had a lot of great stuff. But basically, for getting started in the studios, it was just, I mean, I just have ideas all the time, and some of them will really hook me. And I'll work on it and work on it and work on it in my head, and then just find the people to sort of plug into whatever needed to happen in the studio. And that's how it was, pretty much how it was done on my end.
Well,
I was just
had kind of a direct connection to the studios with Margie too, being your housemate.
Yes, we were, when we were in the dorm, we were right next to each other. Then we were housemates, and she was a real science brain, but she was also a real music lover, and she was in the audio mod. So we just cooked up stuff all the time and, got people together, and just went in the studio and had a good old time.
Yeah, nice that you had the resource there to like just go in and record and work on stuff at, instead of dealing with like traditional, studio time where you have to like, pay per hour and all that kind of stuff. So gave you some freedom to just explore and experiment and do the things you wanted to do.
It did. Yeah, 100%. And it was, everything on American Rituals was done in that fashion for sure.
Yeah. Steve, how about you? Were you also doing recording in the studio at Evergreen or elsewhere?
I think it took me longer to get hooked into the studio thing there. I think I was like when I first went to Evergreen, I was kind of trying to compose music that was sort of influenced by like Morton Feldman and George Crumb
Yeah.
sort of thing, this kind of very spacious but abstract, you know, uh, and so I was more working with live musicians, but then I also pretty quickly got caught up in playing in rock bands. Steve Fisk was also in that class with us, and he and I started working together as this duo called Customer Service.
Okay.
He had released a 45 called Snake Attack under the name Anonymous, and so one side was him doing Snake Attack, and the other was this kind of prog band called Conch.
Okay.
That were really into like, Gentle Giant and Yes and Genesis and all that stuff. And they had done this kind of faux punk rock song that was in some bizarre meter or something.
Mm-hmm.
And which was this song called Corporate Food that ended up on the Let Them Eat Jelly Beans compilation.
Oh yeah.
And so there was this 45 out that Steve wanted to be able to like, kind of play shows for and hawk. And so we started this duo, and his partner at the time, Heidi Drucker, was a vocalist who would sometimes work with us. And so that kind of plugged me into the underground rock scene in Olympia and Seattle.
Right. Yeah. So, I mean, it seems like during this time, we're talking about the late 70s, right? Or very early
79, 80.
Yeah.
81.
So you had the kind of punk movement was pretty much in full swing, new wave punk, post-punk.
Yeah. And there was kind of an interesting like power struggle going on at Evergreen at that time, between the kind of hippie people that had been the dominant subculture there, and that kind of giving way to punk. And there was a lot of misunderstanding and animosity, but also places where they met too,
Right.
I mean, it was kind of interesting.
Yeah, because in the liner notes, for Cheri's album, you kind of mentioned this friction, that it seems like both of you embraced, all kinds of
All of
music.
it.
Yeah, and we're just interested in Morton Feldman, but punk music and world music and anything else. But maybe that wasn't reciprocated, in the other direction with some of the people who were in the punk scene, probably.
Yeah, and I think a lot of that drama played out around the radio station Chaos, which had sort of previously been run by, jazz loving hippie type folks.
Okay.
And was being gradually taken over by young, artsy punk rock people.
Yeah.
And there was kind of a power struggle there. So it's all right. It's all good now.
Yeah. I mean, that's all important stuff, right?
And I think that people did. I mean, actually, Cheri, you were kind of one of the people that sort of went across those lines. I think you knew people in both camps and were friends with,
definitely. And there was, and to a horn that I love to toot any time I get the chance is Magazine, Lost Music Network, John Foster, Dana Squires. They were everything. They did everything by the issues were by the alphabet, and it just the one thing is that it was independently produced music, and so it just was very genre expansive.
And this was a local or regional magazine at the time?
It was actually a national magazine.
Oh, it was, okay.
Yeah. And John was, I believe he was the music director.
Yeah, so I replaced John as music director at Chaos.
Yeah.
And I got there and there were all these op magazines under the desk, and I was like, what's all this?
Yeah. But I mean, it was very deliberate. He spent, the story that I got was that he basically was at the radio station making contacts for pretty much 2 years straight, writing letters to people all over the country and talking about OP and the Lost Music Network. And he was really one of the first. It was a national magazine. It was a newspaper like, I think it was like, what do they call it? A bifold or whatever.
Mhm.
Anyway, and it got mailed around to a lot of people. And I mean, I heard, from people at Chaos who went to NFCB, conferences and radio conferences that, everybody would always ask about John and about Op, and, it was held in very high regard.
Yeah.
And that was, just and, I remember just loving to help Dana, do little things for the magazine. She used to do the layout. It's a great magazine, or a great paper.
Yeah, and the other thing that John did at Chaos that was so important was he started what was called the Green Line policy. So they had a thing where you could play whatever you want on your show, but it had to be 80% independent label stuff. And so independent label records all had a green line on the spine, and major label records all had a red line on the spine. And you were expected to lean heavily on the green lines, whatever kind of show you were doing.
That's great. I mean, a lot of times it was just the opposite, right?
Right.
Yeah.
Right. And like, I remember him, like, somebody was substituting for an afternoon jazz show once, and they were saying, well, I don't really know that much about jazz. And he'd say, it's okay, just play all the records with the ugliest covers.
That's great. Yeah.
Yeah, that's funny.
Did you guys have a connection with like the Seattle scenes that were going on at the time, or did Olympia feel kind of like this little isolated place? Yeah. I
mean, Steve Fisk and I had a connection with the sort of indie rock scene in Seattle, but like there was a guy named Herb Levy was running a series called Soundworks up in Seattle that was like a, sort of experimental concert series. And I think I went to one or two of those, but it never occurred to me to like follow that regularly or get involved or do anything for it. I mean, it felt far away.
Yeah.
I also, though, made connections with the Palace of Lights guys, with Cheri Lima.
Right.
And I think probably that was because some, like, one of their first records showed up at Chaos or at Op Magazine or something. And I was like, hey, these guys are doing this sort of like-minded stuff. And so that became a connection too. But they were pretty insulated as well. I mean, they were not really part of the bigger Seattle music scene so much.
Right. Yeah. That's a good segue, because I have the Regional Zeal compilation here that Steve put together, right?
Yeah.
It even has your personal contact on the back.
With a Dana Squires cover drawing.
Yeah. Yep. This is like an old radio station copy or something, but Cheri, this is actually the first time I heard your music, and I, was going to ask about that too. A couple things, Steve, how did this compilation come together? You kind of just mentioned you had connected with Cheri in Seattle. But Cheri, I also wanted to ask you, it seemed like, the other recordings that are on American Rituals came out on, like limited edition cassettes and very kind of small run things that were probably only distributed, regionally or tape trading circles, things like that. So if you guys both want to speak on, this compilation and anything else about how your music was, released at the time.
Well, I have to admit, the things that really stand out for me was being in that group contract, which, by the way, was called The Making of Music.
Okay.
We did an album, and I think that was Steve. I think, wasn't it Steve Fisk and you, or who are the people who really spearheaded those two records?
Oh, those Evergreen albums? No, it was not us. There were other people that were involved in spearheading that. And I think part of that came out of, so Mr. Brown, which was the label that John Foster started, they had done the Anonymous single, and they had done this 12-inch EP called Life Elsewhere with the Beakers and Steve Fisk and John Foster on it. And there was some controversy about that because it had been recorded at the college, and like there was some deal about using, you know, state facilities to make, you know, commercial products kind of thing. You know, like anybody was making money off of this. And so I believe that then there was sort of this push to like, well, let's do a legitimate evergreen record project, you know, like if people are making records anyway, like we should do that as promotion for the college and for the music program and stuff. And I don't, I mean, I don't think I or Steve Fisk had anything to do with spearheading that at all. I don't remember who did. There was a couple. Like there was like yeah,
I was going to say, I do remember very distinctly Steve coming out of the administrative building where the library was with somebody else. And
Peter Ranlett, maybe?
Yeah, and they had gotten funding or they had gotten permission or something. And they came over and they were like, yeah, we get to do this record. So, I mean, there was one year, 1980, I think, and then the next one was put out in 81, and one of them was called E equals MC squared. Yeah, plus or minus 1 dB. And the first one, what was that called?
Like
I can't even remember.
Expressions or something like that. I can't.
Yeah, it was. But those I remember, and you know, quite frankly, I do remember the Mouth Music from Olympia, Washington. But all the other releases, some of them I knew had happened, but I left Evergreen and Olympia in 82, and after that, some of my things were released on people's various projects. But, you know, the way I always felt about it was good on you. You know, if you want to do something with this, go for it.
Yeah.
I just always felt that way about the whole group of people. We had our sort of philosophies about the world and about music and about the music business and money and all that. And I pretty much think we were all in agreement that we should just have a free for all and just release everybody's stuff. And it was all good. And I was really down with that. And so I didn't even find out about a couple of the things, or I either did that or I forgot, and was reintroduced when Pete Swanson, and Jed approached me. They had these compilations and I was really struggling to remember them. So I was, anyway, so long answer to a short question.
Yeah.
And I mean, as far as the Regional Zeal album, I think that was just like one of those moments where I suddenly realized I know all these people doing kind of unusual things with voices.
Yeah.
And that would make kind of a cool compilation. And it was as simple as that. And, you know, I asked Steve Fisk and Peter Ranlett to help me with it. And I think also Carrie Limer had offered for me to do something for Palace of Lights, and I was not anywhere near ready to do a solo record.
Okay.
You know, there was no way. And so I think it was an alternate plan to that.
Yeah.
I think Carrie might still regret it to this day a little bit. But it's definitely one of the sleepers in the Palace of Lights catalog.
Yeah. I think I mentioned it to him once, and he was like, "Oh yeah, I didn't have anything to do with that. That was Steve."
Yeah. The reviews were not that great.
Well, there's some great music on it, so yeah, I really like it.
I mean, I find it kind of charming in retrospect. You know, I mean, great, no, but charming, yes.
Yeah. Cheri, I wanted to talk to you about your connection and relationship with Pauline Oliveros. Steve mentions this in the liner notes as well. You met her around 1981 or so, and was she teaching or came to Evergreen?
No, actually, I met Pauline when Steve and a bunch of us piled in a car and went to San Francisco for New Music America 81 at the Japan Center and other venues. And I met Pauline at the Exploratorium. And it was like during the day, and there was something going on there, some workshops. And I just walked up to her, and there weren't a lot of people there, and which was kind of how it was in those days. And I just walked up to her and struck up a conversation and asked her if she would be teaching anywhere. And she said, well, I'm going to New York. I'm going to be in a place called Mount Tremper, New York, at the Zen Arts Center. And that's where I'm going to be. And so I made arrangements to go there and, enter, go to the monastery and live in the monastery and do the practice with everyone. And I had a chance to hang out a lot with Pauline and also her partner at the time. She goes under the name Linda Mary Montano now, but it was just Linda Montano at the time. And she also, I had no idea how much I was going to really groove on what her whole life perspective was, but she was great and just full of beans and a fearless woman, and both of them. And that's how I got to Mount Tremper, and I stayed there. I went back in the fall and then came back for the winter. I was there 3 months or something.
So this was when you left Evergreen and went.
And I just went back there just for 3 months. My family lived nearby.
Right.
And then after I stayed with my family for a little while because school hadn't started. And then I went back to finish up the year. And that was my last year at Evergreen.
And
I remember dropping Cheri off at this huge truck stop on the outskirts of Portland, and she hitched a ride with a truck driver. And I'm like, really? And she's like, oh, yeah, I'll find a ride with somebody. It'll be fine.
I know.
Goodbye. Hope you make it.
Yeah. I can't. And I met this guy. His name was Mel, and he just popped pills the entire way. We made it to a truck stop that was, within 5 miles of where my mother's house was. And, I had been sleeping, and, he would stop and he would say, he said this probably 10 times. He goes, yeah, I know I take these pills, but I make sure I eat my meals. And so, he stopped and he, fed me the whole way across. And then my mom, he met my mom at this truck stop, and we all had breakfast together, and then he went on his merry way up to Maine. It was so
Mel, if you're out there, bless you.
Yeah, those are the days, right?
It could have been way worse.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, hitchhiking was a lot more normal back then, I suppose, to get around. But you said the Zen Art Center, is that also, that's known as the Zen Mountain Monastery now?
Correct. Yeah. Yep.
Dido Lori was the teacher there.
Yep.
I went there a few different times for a couple of retreats. It's an amazing place.
Yeah.
It's actually before Dido passed away, but special location right there.
Yes, absolutely. And I met all kinds of really there were a lot of musicians around. There was also Carl Berger and Ingrid Berger and New Music Studio, which was, I think,
Creative Music Studio.
What is it?
Creative Music Studio.
Yeah, Creative Music Studio. And I think that was in Woodstock or somewhere near there, and saw some performances. Marilyn Crispell was there at the time, and I got to listen to her play, just sitting in the room. She was just, wailing away on the keyboard. A lot of, but that was a long history there at this point.
Yeah. And so after that period of time, were you still making music, or were you kind of getting involved with, some other things, or, where did life take you?
Well,
I guess.
yeah, I did my last semester at Evergreen, and American Rituals was basically done at that point.
Yeah.
I did one more piece, the piece Breathe. That was done in the spring of 82. And when I was at Zen Art Center, I did a bunch of more process, sort of conceptual pieces that had to do with my love of goats and, goats with bells and things like that. And I think those were really, I realized I could do those, which was actually, I've been obsessed with bells on goats, lots of them. And, what could happen if you actually did something with that in real time. And it was definitely Linda Montano who made me realize that it was doable.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I did all that work with actually, and showed all of that stuff to both Pauline and Linda, and talked about it at great length, among other things. And then I took off and came back east.
Okay. Yeah. And those would have been more like, site specific, real time performances or whatever. Yeah.
Exactly.
Just to be there to experience it.
Yes.
Steve, how about you? What happened, after you left Evergreen? What were you up to? Or
oh boy, for my last year at Evergreen, I did an internship at Franklin Furnace in New York, and I became very involved in the sort of downtown free improviser scene at that time.
This was like the early 80s or mid 80s.
Yeah. And then I went back to Olympia, and I thought I was going to stay there for a while, but then I got a call offering me a job at a new music distribution service. Because when I had been there during my internship at Franklin Furnace, I had gone in there, and I mean, I knew them because of Op Magazine and Chaos and all of that. And I kind of offhandedly said, hey, while I'm here, if you need any extra help, let me know. Well, they didn't call me until after I finished and moved back to Olympia. But it sort of was like, you're offering me a job at New Music Distribution. And Zena Parkins was a friend of mine who was getting ready to go on tour for 6 months and needed somebody to sublet her place. And so I moved back to New York and did that. And then I got to New Music Distribution Service and found out that the guy that I was supposed to replace hadn't, in fact, quit. And the guy who had offered me the job had totally forgotten that he had offered me the job.
Oh, man.
So I showed up and I'm like, hi. And they're like, who are you?
Yeah.
Oh boy.
So maybe need an extra person to work here. I don't know.
Yeah. Well, so then they felt bad and kind of gave me some part-time work doing things. And Carla Bley hired me to be her gopher at her rehearsals, to go buy coffee and cigarettes for her band and stuff, because I think they all felt bad about it. And it was all right. It all worked out, and I ended up staying for a few more years and kind of picking up where I left off with the improvised music scene there. And then I ended up in '88 moving to Santa Fe, New Mexico, which is a whole other story. But that was kind of the next phase. And then while I was there, a guy that we had known at Evergreen, Jonathan Scheuer, called me up and said he was starting this nonprofit, Non Sequitur, and did I want a job running it? And we started off as a label and did a bunch of CDs, and now we run a venue and produce concerts here in Seattle. So that's the thumbnail version.
Yeah, great. Yeah, this is that's great. Is there any other kind of areas you wanted to talk about? I feel like we've covered a lot here. No.
Not really.
If you have questions, we can.
Yeah, I'm trying to look through some of my questions. I think we covered a lot of it here. So, yeah.
I also don't know how much time you have for this, because it could go on.
Yeah, well, I think we're doing pretty good here. Probably wrap it up shortly, but Cheri, why don't you just tell us like what you're doing now, and how you feel about this music, kind of getting a wider, exposure, some 40 years later.
Um, that's a good question. Um, well, it really came out of nowhere, obviously.
Hmm.
And Steve will probably remember this. Like, I got a call and he said, "Well, this guy emailed me and wants your contact information. I told you you probably weren't interested." And I kind of wasn't, but
Yeah.
I said, "No, I'll take it anyway." And I had a phone conversation with Pete Swanson, and he was just so enthusiastic. I was really
Yeah.
taken aback
He's very
because,
enthusiastic.
one of the things that's, Steve will probably agree with this. I think, in 1980, there were definitely people who listened to all the music that we're talking about today.
Hmm.
But my family, when I played them American Rituals 40 years ago, they thought I was nuts. And
Yeah.
when I would tell people, "Yeah, I'm going to go to New York for a semester and work with Pauline Oliveros," they're like, "Who?"
Yeah.
This music was just not what it is today.
Right.
And I played for many years in bands and did other things. And, it's been about 20 years that I've been totally out of the music scene.
Hmm.
And, long story short is when Pete and Jed and Matt Worth from RVNG, once we got the ball rolling, and decided that there was enough material there to do, and that it was a go. I just, went online and got the lay of the land, which was it was mind boggling to me how many labels and how many bands and artists, and it's just overwhelming. And there just didn't seem to be so many people around doing it. I know a lot of
Yeah.
it's, the internet, but at any rate, yeah, I mean, I'm I work with this woman who is, gosh, I think she's probably 19 years old. And she looked up American Rituals on Spotify
Right.
and liked it. And I was completely shocked. And it really told me something about young people and the amount of music they've been exposed to. And just over the last 40 years, people are listening to this type of music all over the map.
Yeah, for sure.
We were talking about it earlier about Epsilon Spires and
Hmm.
10 Forward in Greenfield. And, there's people coming through there all the time that are doing really amazing work. So, and I sort of got off the track, but oh yeah. And the other thing I realized is about 2 years ago, I realized that for $1,000, I could have a studio in my house. So I put one together post haste.
I was going to say, I see
And-
a bass hanging on the
I know.
wall back there.
Oh yeah, that's the beast. I went back to my bass teacher from 30 years ago. I borrowed an electric bass from a friend of mine, which is an instrument I played for many years and loved dearly. And I just played it for a while, and I realized I was done with it. And I was like, well, maybe I'll go back to upright. So I went back to her, and I started taking, just brush up lessons again, and got a bass. And yeah, it's definitely, it's a hard instrument to play, but I'm loving it. It's so fun.
Well, that's great. Great to hear
Yeah.
you're working on some music again. And Steve, how about you? What's new? Any new projects, or just continuing to book concerts and things like that?
Yeah, that's my day job, so that's ongoing. I put out a couple of things recently with Carrie Leimer and Mark Barreca under the name of 3 Point Circle. Those were kind of interesting collaborations to work on. We released one this year and early this year, and one kind of late fall, I think, last year.
Mm-hmm.
I play in a group called the Seattle Phonographers Union, which is sort of a loose collective of people that improvises with unprocessed field recordings.
Mm-hmm.
I don't perform very often. I mean, I perform with the Phonographers Union, but that's really, and sometimes I'll do field recording stuff with other people, like in an improvised situation, but no like organized music groups or anything. I've never really been that fond of performing live.
Yeah.
I was doing a lot of installations for a while, but that's kind of dried up. There's just only so many venues around to do that in, and
Right.
Locally, and then nationally, unless you're famous, they don't really want to like be flying you out there to do all that stuff. So,
Right.
I do what there is to do.
Yeah. Well, I appreciate both of you chatting with me today. Thank you, Cheri and Steve.
Yeah.
And
Thanks
Thank
for
you.
having us.
yeah, hopefully we'll get to meet both of you or either of you at some point along the line. So, all right.
Good. I
Take
miss
care.
you.
All right. Thanks
Yeah.
so much.
Thanks
Bye-bye.
a lot.
Bye,
Bye-bye.
Greg. Bye, Steve.
Bye, Cheri.
Bye.